I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 134 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Please address all comments through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted by committee on Thursday, February 28, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the Fisheries Act review. I'd like to welcome our witnesses for our first panel. We have on Zoom Nikki Scoose, Director of Northern Confluence, and Claire Canet, Project Manager for the Association of Professional Fishermen from Southern Gaspésie. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. Mrs. Goose, you have the floor for the first 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, point of privilege.
Great.
Yes, Mr. Perkins.
I would like to move a point of privilege. I apologize to the witnesses, but the House of Commons standing orders require that a point of privilege be moved at the earliest opportunity. And I'm raising a point of privilege related to the Minister of Fisheries' testimony on estimates last week. The Minister misled this committee in response to my questions around enforcement in the Bay of Fundy. The Minister said that, and I quote, this was on December 4th, effectively this work started with fisheries associations in relation to consultation. I have letters and have had conversations over the weekend. Most of the groups attached to me, and they were shocked to learn that the Minister made such a claim, because none of them had been consulted by the Minister. So given that, I would like to move the following privilege motion, Mr. Chair, if I could. Given that, A, Minister Le Boutelier told the committee on December 4th, 2024, that, quote, effectively this work started with the Fisheries Association, end quote, in reference to department's work on fisheries enforcement on the Bay of Fundy, and B, various fisheries associations advise the committee members that no such consultation or discussions were held with any interested stakeholders, including the Bay of Fundy Inshore Fishermen's Association, Brazil Rock 3334 Fishermen's Association, Coldwater Lobster Association, Scotia Fundy Inshore Fishermen's Association, Cape Breton Fish Harvesters Association, the Eastern Shore Fishermen's Protective Association, Fundy North Fishermen's Association, the Gulf of Nova Scotia Bonafide Fishermen's Association, the Guysborough Inshore Fishermen's Association, and the Richmond County Fishermen's Association, that the committee therefore instructs the analyst to prepare a report to the House forthwith outlining Minister Diane Le Boutelier's potential breach of privilege. That motion, I believe, has been circulated. The clerk who can circulate it to members when available. This is an important issue when a member's privilege is breached. When the Minister comes before a committee on estimates, she's expected to tell the truth. And I asked, as I do, a forthright question that was very, very clear and unambiguous in either language, which said how much consultation did you do, how much discussion did you do in enforcement. In fact, I held up the DFO response to my order paper question, which showed absolutely no enforcement going on. And this isn't the first time the Minister, both before this committee and publicly with the media, had claimed that there was lots of enforcement going on. But not only that, but that she was talking to fishing associations. Now, some of those associations, and I'll read what they have written me as a result of the minister's statement. Just give me a second. So, Heather Mullock from the Coldwater Lobster Association. I was watching the committee testimony yesterday, and I would like to point out that there has been no consultation with Coldwater Lobster Association and the federal minister on enforcement in the Bay of Fundy since the Minister Le Boutelier was appointed, not just this summer. Any indication otherwise is untrue. This is from Dan Fleck which is the Brazil Rock Association, and Brazil Rock, of course, and Dan is a former DFO employee who represents Brazil Rock. He writes, in regards to the minister's statement in FOPO, she has not been working with associations, have never met with her, had one 15-minute phone call over a year ago. She and her DMs have not attended a Southwest Nova Scotia SWNS Association meeting. In September 2024, a weekly call commenced with local CMP, 20-minute call with CMP, during which we were told, quotes, can't talk about ongoing operations and we see some traps from unknown persons. We made an arrest, which may or may not have been in Southwest Nova Scotia. So no consultation going on with these groups. Colin Spurl, who represents United Fishing Conservation Alliance, which is the largest fishing organization group in the Maritimes, representing almost 5,000 harvesters, wrote to me, the Unified Fisheries Conservation Alliance is not being consulted by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
We have a point of order from Mr. Morrissey. Oh,
I just put my hand up when he's through.
To speak.
I thought it was point of order. Go ahead, Mr. Perkins. I'm
So
sorry.
Colin Spurl, who speaks for the United Fishing Conservation Alliance, which represents about a dozen fishing organizations representing almost 5,000 harvesters in the Maritimes, wrote, the Unified Fisheries Conservation Alliance is not being consulted by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in any meaningful way in any hopes of improving fishery enforcement on the Bay of Fundy. In fact, we're pleased we continue to be ignored while our fisheries and communities descend into chaos. Any statements otherwise are misleading and dismissive of the crisis that continues to widen across the Maritimes. We are ready and willing to sit down at any table to collaborate on fishing conservation. These are important statements by the most important fishing associations in the Maritimes, which totally contradicts the minister's assertion before this committee that she was consulting with these associations, that she had talked to these associations this summer. In fact, most of these associations, all of them in fact, have said that they have never talked to her on any issue, let alone conservation. So for the minister to sit here and tell members of parliament in a parliamentary committee that she had started on the enforcement issue and consulted with associations is a fabrication. It's unconscionable and it's a breach of members of parliament privilege. Can we actually have a Minister of the Crown on Fisheries come here and acknowledge the fact that they have not done their job, the fact that the minister has never come to Southwest Nova Scotia and met with any fishing groups, has never even picked up the phone and called any Southwest Nova Scotia fishing groups on the issue of enforcement or any other issue. Yet when pressed here, she says she started by consulting with the fishing associations. That's clearly not true. In fact, a number of occasions, these groups, and in particular, the United Fisheries Conservation Alliance, asked this summer for meetings with the minister and the minister's office. And guess how many meetings happened? None. Yet the minister has got the gall to sit here in committee in the middle of a fishing crisis that's been built up over 6 Liberal fisheries ministers, and in particular numbers 4, 5, and 6, who have ignored everything and all the poaching that is going on in the lobster fishery. Lobster fishery reports right now in the first 2 weeks of the season in Southwest Nova Scotia are the catches are down over 30% over last year's December catch, which was a terrible year. And after 7 to 8 years of illegal poaching in the birthplace of lobster, St. Mary's Bay, where lobsters from New England and all over Nova Scotia go to breed, are fished in the summer, 10,000 traps. There is zero enforcement by the minister's own numbers. Out of 10,000 traps, they seized 239 this past summer. That is not enforcement. That's a joke. And they're destroying the livelihood. Could there be some connection? Do you know, and I don't know if members on this committee realize this, it takes 7 years for lobster to grow to the point at which it is at the minimum size to catch. So is it shocking to members that this minister doesn't seem to care? That this minister knows that after 7 or 8 years of poaching, we're finding year after year after year in southwest Nova Scotia the catches down. And they're down because we've gone back to pre-1977. And do you know what happened in 1977? And I will give him credit. The Minister of Fisheries, Romeo LeBlanc, said this has got to stop. We were down to 23,000 metric tons of lobster catching. So they created the lobster fishing areas and said that we're no longer going to fish year-round, because fishing year-round and fishing when lobster are breeding will destroy the stock. We're not even sure now that dropping from 100,000 metric tons down to 23,000 is
Mr.
actually
Chair, point of order, please.
going to... I don't think you can do points of order in a privilege discussion, but I'll leave it to the chair.
Well, I guess, and who knows, you could even challenge that this is a point of order. I think that, the honourable member is litigating the issue until we've heard both sides. He's raised the issue. I guess it would be useful if he went right to what he sees now as the resolution. What would he like to have happen now? Because we do have witnesses here, at their time and expense, and we would like to obviously get to them. Not to diminish what the honourable members brought up, but can we, put a bow on this one and get on with the business of the Fisheries Act?
For me to rule on that,
I didn't know, was that a point of order or a point of debate?
point of privilege takes precedent, as the member said.
Right.
So, Mr. Perkins, you have the floor.
Thank you. The whole point of creating these areas was so that the fishery was not fished when lobsters are breeding, and the result of that is that we've grown up to about 130,000 metric tons, which is declined the last couple of years. So it's to the point, which is why enforcement is so critical and not happening. And the minister has had lots of opportunity since she became minister to ask her department what was really going on. She's had lots of opportunity to talk to the actual groups, which she has chosen not to do. She has had lots of opportunity to come to Nova Scotia and meet with the groups. If she doesn't have that courage, then at least she should have picked up the phone when these groups have been asking for meetings with her on enforcement. And it got so bad this summer, that the local head of CNP admitted to the Scotia Fundry Inshore Association after their protest in New Brunswick that they had zero enforcement in the Bay of Fundy, and because that group threatened to go on the water within 3 days and enforce the law, that the DFO sent in and, as the police say, showed the doors and brought some boats in for 4 or 5 days to try and calm everything down. But that's the only 4 or 5 days that there was any enforcement whatsoever on the Bay of Fundy this summer. And so for the minister to come here after all of that, if she didn't hear it directly from the groups, she might have read it in the paper and the newspaper clips that she would have been given by her team, at least to see. It was all over the news. And if she wasn't willing to read the newspaper clips, she could have seen the TV clips on it. And if she didn't know which channel to look on or look at or which website to look at, she had to look at her favorite CBC, who has been covering this all summer, both on TV and in person. But yet, for some reason, the minister still was oblivious to that and came here and claimed that she had started on enforcement with the consultation with fishing groups. The evidence is clear. I can table all these, and will table all these notes from the associations. The process, as I understand it, Mr. Chair, is that the clerk prepares a report on this for you to present, I guess, to the House and the Speaker if it is felt that the minister has breached privilege, and that requires not only the words of the minister here, which are self-evident, but the response from the fishing groups, which I can provide to this committee, so that they can, and the clerk can take a look at that, even double check and call those folks. They'd be more than willing, I'm sure, to talk to the research, the analysts, and the clerks as to whether or not they agree with me or not that the minister misled this committee. So to Mr. Hardy's point, I will leave it there because I'm sure there are some others that may want to comment on this, and I'll reserve to come back later if I need to add anything further.
Mr. Morrissey.
Excuse me. Thank you, Chair. Well, the premise of Mr. Perkins' privilege is his reference to the minister stating she consulted. Well, in order for somebody to rule that there was a privilege violation, you would then have to understand the thought process the minister was having when she made that comment. Consulting as a minister is both plural as well as singular. A minister can reference they began consulting by simply having the staff of the department as responsible advise and going through. Mr. Perkins is leading to believe that the minister themselves would have to be present and engaging with everybody there, knowing that this simply could not be the case, Mr. Chair. Any minister would have access to information and be briefed on information using a plurality of mediums that they would have access to. And so was the minister, I did not feel that the minister, I was comfortable that the minister was providing accurate information, given as well. It's important for this committee to do it. The minister is a francophone, and in understanding sometimes the questioning and giving the answer is sometimes a bit gets lost. But to view that a member's privilege was violated by the minister saying they consulted, and then the member pointing out that the minister was not on the ground in the area to talk to people. Really, a minister has, as would any politician, would be certainly valid by indicating they consulted by using a various methods, including being briefed by the department personnel as well as others on exactly what may be happening in an area. So, Mr. Chair, that's my I do not feel that there was any privilege, but that's not for me to make. That's for you as a chair. But I think it's important to, it would have to have clear that the minister knowingly provided an answer that was erroneous and that the minister knew it was erroneous. Mr. Chair, that's a tall order. Thank you.
I'll now go to Ms. Barron.
Thank you, Chair. I was just reading up on how the questions of privilege work on all my processes here. Couple things. So first of all, I want to thank MP Perkins for bringing forward this concern and the concerns that are being brought forward by associations in his riding. I think it's important if there is information that was not clear or was untruthful, then it is important that we talk about it. I mean, let's be honest, I don't feel that the minister, quite frankly, answered my questions very well either when I was here, but that's a whole different story. So I have a few questions that I was hoping that perhaps MP Perkins could answer, and then we could take it from there. First thing is, are there any other associations that aren't listed in this motion that the minister could have been referencing? That was the first question that came to mind. The other question is, was there a process of trying to receive clarification from the minister around what she was referencing when she did say that she had done consultation? The other thing that stands out to me is around the fact that this is a breach of privilege motion, but in the motion itself it says that there's a potential breach of privilege. And the two don't coincide for me. Is it a breach of privilege or is it a potential breach of privilege? And does that change our process moving forward? Because I know there's a process, if there is a breach of privilege, that the committee write a letter to be presented to the House as was being described. But if we don't have actual evidence of that breach of privilege, what is our process moving forward? And so it's not that I agree or disagree. I'm just asking for more information, because if there isn't actual evidence of a true breach of privilege, would it be more appropriate for us to, for example, write a letter to the minister asking for answers to the questions and then determine whether there is a breach of privilege based on the response that the minister provides? So just trying to make sure that we're moving forward in the most effective manner to, to get the answers that we need and decide as a committee how we want to move forward. But I do agree with the concerns, just to clarify, and my goal is to have us move forward in the most effective way to be able to bring to light the concerns that MP Perkins has brought to the table today.
Ms. Barron, we'll now go to Mr. Bragdon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And sure, I appreciate you allowing me to speak to this. I think what Mr. Perkins has brought to the floor is very important. It's a matter of him doing his job and representing the concerns of his constituents and key stakeholders from the industry. We're dealing with people's livelihoods. They have huge concerns and a lot of frustration that's built up over a number of years. All of us around this table, I just haven't spent time with you. I know all of us around this table want to do everything that we can to ensure that there's a future healthy stock of lobster and fish so that the livelihoods and the way of life of many Canadians and coastal Canadians in particular can be protected. Mr. Perkins has raised this for. Yeah.
Ms. Barron and Mr. Perkins, if you want to have a conversation, could you take it outside? Because I'm hearing three voices coming through. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Bragdon.
So I feel like it's very important that this is taken seriously and that a determination is wrought on this, because not only is it his parliamentary privilege, but also the privilege of every one of us at this table. If we're not getting accurate information or forthright, honest information back when questions are being asked, it's hard to make good decisions, accurate reports, put together recommendations, because especially when a minister is speaking to something, it carries weight with it, especially for the determination of what kind of report's going to come back and what recommendations are going to be given. We have to make sure and ensure that that feedback that's being given by the minister is accurate, honest, forthright, and does not mislead the people who are most affected by these decisions, nor the members of parliament that are around this table. So I do appreciate any consideration that the clerk or the team and the chair can give to this matter, and that we can certainly find out for sure, which to me it's very apparent based on the feedback we got directly from stakeholders that you would think any minister that is doing the job seriously and very much concerned about the future of the fishery in our region would be communicating and consulting with these very groups that were named by Mr. Perkins. If not, there's something severely lacking, because those are the ones who represent the people whose livelihoods are going to be directly impacted by the actions or inactions of the particular minister. So I really think the committee deserves a clear answer on this, and that the Canadians deserve a clear answer on this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to apologize to the witnesses who we're very appreciative of, but in addition, I'd like to apologize to all the witnesses. Well, I don't have to apologize. It's the other side that needs to apologize, that these witnesses have come, they've borne their heart and soul to this committee, they've given evidence that's been referenced in our reports, and reports that have been reflective of their testimony, and things aren't just getting done. They're just not getting done. Based on the reports that we're putting to the minister, we're not seeing any movement, any activity, any action whatsoever. So I know it's frustrating for our witnesses, and it's even more frustrating for ourselves to have to do this today. But, you know, MP Barron just mentioned that her questions didn't get answered last week by the minister. My questions didn't get answered. She answered every single one of them with the exact same talking points. And stakeholders reached out to me and said, Cliff, what's going on? Why won't the minister answer the questions? Well, is it for the same reasons that she ignores the reports coming out of here on owner-operator, concentration of corporate, a corporate concentration of fishing licenses and whatnot? That report is just sitting there, and I'm sure Ms. Kane, she understands, and one of the biggest things on her mind is that owner-operator is falling through the cracks in the Fisheries Act. And MP Perkins just referenced Mr. Sproul. I spoke to Mr. Sproul and had emailed Mr. Sproul quite a few times this summer. While this lack of enforcement was happening, while this out-of-season fishing was happening, he reached out to the minister several times. The minister had been in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, a couple of hours drive away from Mr. Sproul and those that sit on his the board of his association. They were completely ignored. They couldn't get meetings to discuss this very, very, very important subject. And the latest I've heard from stakeholders that I've spoken to in southwest Nova Scotia is that St. Mary's Bay is a desert. It's barren. There's absolutely nothing left. The catch rates are bad enough on the outside, 30, 40, 50 miles offshore, where those lobsters would have been born in St. Mary's Bay and migrated out to those grounds. And it's bad out there. It's 30% below last year, which was 30% below the year before. But in the inner waters of the bay in St. Mary's Bay, there's absolutely nothing. And these concerns have been raised again and again and again by commercial lobster fishermen in southwest Nova Scotia. It's been going on for years and years and years. So when the minister references the consultation she's had, I'd like to see that documented for transparency. Who these stakeholders were that she consulted. Because obviously she's not consulting with stakeholders whose livelihood has been thrown under the bus. There may be some stakeholders that she's consulted with. They certainly don't represent those fishers and the crew members in those fishing enterprises that right now are facing excruciating times economically, and it's about to get worse. And you might say, well, lobster's $11 a pound, and then someone landed 5,000 pounds of lobsters last week. Well, you're looking at enterprises here, Mr. Speaker, that have $1.5, $2 million worth of financing at a bank with these interest rates that are through the roof. The mental health of this fleet of lobster fishers in Nova Scotia right now is at the breaking point. It's bad. They've watched this get progressively worse. So if you look at the trajectory that this lobster fishery in southwest Nova Scotia is on, where it's come from, where it is, and it's pretty easy to connect the dots and make a projection of where it's going to go, and it's going to be many, many times worse. And it doesn't have to be. There's seasons for reasons. And for the minister to come out and say that she consulted with the stakeholders it's erroneous. She's been careless with the truth. And I'd like to see some evidence of these consultations. I heard Mr. Morrissey reference the minister's thought process, her thought process that day. Well, I'm sure the minister had several days of preparing for that meeting last week.
Point of order, I did not reference the minister's thought process. I could not do that. I do not know. I made a comment that I did not understand what the minister's thought process would be.
You did not understand.
Okay.
That's what he claims he
He
said.
referenced her thought process. He didn't understand her, Mr. Chair, whether he didn't understand it or he understood it, he did reference her thought process.
Yes,
So-
that he didn't understand her thought process.
So he did reference
Okay,
the thought process.
All right.
So this issue needs to be dealt with by the committee. The fact that the minister has failed, the sixth minister, the sixth failure to the fish harvesters, the processing side of the industry, the communities, the coastal rural communities of southwest Nova Scotia, and it's not just southwest Nova Scotia in which this out of season fishing is happening. And my colleague, Mr. Perkins, will be able to speak to that a little bit later, but it's happening in several areas of Nova Scotia. And he referenced what was happening in Fundy North. So this is a very, very, very big deal. This is something that we're going to have to be dealing with in 2 or 3 years down the road in terms of a potential closure of that fishery if this keeps going the way it's going. And we're at a point now where we can do something to stop that from happening. It's a fishery that's worth around $2 billion a year. That's that Southwest Nova lobster fishery. It's a very, very, very big deal. And if not for the mismanagement, we wouldn't be discussing this point of privilege here today. And I thank my colleague for bringing it forward. It's very important. So I hope that when we're through this process on this point of privilege, that we can see some direction, some action that's desperately needed for the lobster fishery in southwest Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm going to suspend for a moment now. The clerk wants to have a word with me, so I'll be right back. Suspend it. And I know I've got a couple of people left to speak. I know Mr. Arnold had his hand up. Mr. Perkins wanted to speak as well. Normally, under a situation of presenting a motion of privilege, all the evidence would have to show that it was actually a point of privilege, and it will be ruled on. But I will go back, look at everything that's been said today to this point, and come back with a ruling to the committee whether I consider it a point of privilege or debate, one or the other. So, Mr. Arnold was next on the
Just
list.
on your...
Okay, all right, go ahead.
If I could just to let you know, I don't know if that cuts off debate or not, but it's not my intent to spend all day debating this, but I do have some stuff from the rules that I would like to quote on it that I didn't do the first time.
Yeah, it do mean that we're cut off. Okay, my ruling is that I will look at the evidence that's given. If you have any other evidence, by all means, send it in, and I will review it all and come back to the committee with a decision.
Well, I think in response, I'm at least owed to be able to respond to MP Barron's questions about what are the rules and process on this, and that is, in terms of adding to it, a little more detail in terms of how this fits.
Okay, I think.
So I need to be able to talk a bit about the Big Green Book, Boston Gagnon, a couple of things that are in it, as
Well,
part
I
of
don't
my
think you need
evidence.
to reference Boston Gagnon right now. If somebody wants to know how it moves on a point of privilege, the clerk would be only too glad to tell them how it works.
I just want to make it clear for the record, because MPs
Well, I'm not
are-
asking you to make it
MPs
clear. I'm
raise it.
saying that the clerk will make it clear to everybody.
Well, then could she? Because I'd like her to breach in page 1060, which deals with this, of Boston Gagnon, so members know that deals with the role of the committee and how privilege gets dealt with it in
Yeah.
committee and the speaker. And also the rules in Boston Gagnon on answering questions and the truthfulness of
I
questions.
haven't got my copy of Boston Gagnon.
There's one right there.
Yeah, that's not mine.
Well, I can read it to you then. Let me read to
I'd
you
rather
what
if
it
you
says.
didn't, but if you want to kill the rest of this
I
half
don't.
hour, go ahead.
I don't.
Go
I
ahead.
don't.
Go ahead.
I don't.
You're taking away time from witnesses.
Chair, on a point of order, you have given direction on this.
Yeah, I did,
Is,
but-
is this a challenge to, is the member now challenging?
privilege motion. I didn't think,
Which he did, the chair
I
did.
don't think you can cut off a
report
point
and
of
was going-
privilege. I don't think you can cut off a point of privilege debate, but
Okay, Mr. Arnold, point of order?
Yes, point of order, Mr. Chair. In the rules, it states that if the chair determines that the question does relate to parliamentary privilege, not whether privilege has been breached or not, but whether it relates to parliamentary privilege, the committee may then consider presenting a report on the question to the House. And then it goes on to say what the report shall be. So it's simply a matter of you deciding whether this issue relates to a point of privilege.
And that's why I said I will come back, look at the information, and come back to committee to my ruling on it. There's no different than if you raise the point of privilege in the House of Commons. Speaker often says, I will look at the evidence and what has been presented, come back to the House with a decision on it, whether it's considered point of privilege or whether it's considered point of debate or anything else for that matter.
well, that's only one of the two issues in terms of the rules and
Chair, again, on a
your
point of
role.
order, where are we going in this? You gave clear instructions. Yes, you're the chair. So we have witness
Look
here
at the
to return
information
to
that
a
has been
meeting.
presented, come back to the committee and determine whether I think from the information I got that it is a point of privilege or a disregard for members in any way in the information that came forward. And I will come back to committee with a ruling, and that's the end of it.
just, I won't read them out, but 443, 444, 445 of Boston Gagnon on the answers to questions should be considered. Did you hear me say that? Yeah. Are you trying to discern what's in my mind and my thinking?
I've said what I've said. I don't need anybody to point out what paragraph to look at or what sentence to look at. I will come back with a ruling on whether I feel it's a point of privilege or not.
Well,
But I'd like to at least have time for the witnesses that are here today
Well,
to
I
at
would-
least have their opening
I
statements.
would like to challenge the chair in his ability to cut this off before we've been able to present all the evidence.
Okay, okay. on. So you'll have to wait till I rule on it to challenge my decision. Yes.
Sorry, Chair, I'm challenging you on your ability to shut down the discussion and presentation of evidence on this. Are you telling me you're not going to allow a challenge to the Chair on your ruling to shut down the privilege motion discussion on presenting evidence?
No,
It's a privilege motion. You can't shut down presentation of evidence. Check Standing Order 116-2. You can't do that.
I checked any orders last week when you were speaking too.
Well,
so,
no, you didn't.
yeah.
But I'm challenging the Chair. You don't have, that's not a debatable motion.
But I haven't ruled on it.
You did. You ruled the shutdown discussion on the motion,
I
Mr.
haven't
Chair.
ruled on the point of privilege.
No,
That's what you can challenge. When I
No,
rule
I'm-
on it, you can challenge it.
You're not listening once again, Mr.
Oh, I'm
Chair.
listening
No, you're
plenty.
not. Mr. Chair, I'm challenging your ability. I'm challenging
Challenge my ability?
Just let me finish my
I'd like
sentence.
to challenge
I'm
yours.
challenging your ability to cut down debate when evidence is still being presented on the motion. I'm not challenging. You didn't make a ruling on the privilege motion. I acknowledge that. You made a ruling to shut down debate on presentation of evidence
Yes.
on the privilege motion, and I'm challenging your ruling on that. There's no because. It's not debatable.
Oh, sorry. Jeez, you're the chair.
Well, learn the rules. It's not debatable. When I challenge the chair, it's not debatable. It's only votable.
Mr. Kellaway.
No, just wondering if can we vote?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Just my small town way of getting to the point.
Yeah, okay.
Well, then I'll keep presenting my evidence if
We'll
it's
keep
not a
going
ruling.
then. We'll all leave and leave you here in the room by yourself.
Well, it's a ruling to either shut down the debate or it isn't, clerk. Which is it? If it's not a rule, well, he's shutting down the debate, and I'm challenging the chair's ruling on that. Are you telling me he hasn't shut down the debate?
He heard what he wanted to hear, and then he's taking deliberation on.
Of course
the
he heard
motion
what
of
he's cutting off the evidence because he doesn't like the issue. But he doesn't have a right as chair to cut down the presentation of issues on a privilege motion. And that's the ruling he made, and I challenged the chair on that. So I think it's obligation of you to hold a vote on that under the rules.
It's not a ruling, so the clerk is telling me we can't vote on it because it's not a ruling.
It is a ruling. You ruled that I could not continue my presentation of evidence. If that's not a ruling, then I'll continue my presentation of evidence.
Yes, Mr. Arnold.
I'd like to read from the standing orders on this. And it says that if a member wishes to raise a question of privilege during a committee meeting or an incident arises in connection with the committee's proceedings that may constitute a breach of privilege, the committee chair allows the member to explain the situation. The chair then determines whether the question raised in fact relates to a parliamentary privilege.
Staff is telling the clerk what to do.
So it seems like we can't move on any further. So
You
No.
allowed the debate on privilege. Are you actually going to shut down the discussion on the privilege on my presentation at the end of the evidence?
Did I say that?
Yes, you did.
No, I didn't.
You did,
You just
because-
asked me, am I going to shut down?
Then
the
can I
meeting?
present the rest of my evidence?
The rest of it?
Yes.
So what else have you got to present?
You won't know unless you let me continue.
Well, I'm not fussy about you continuing either, to tell you the truth. You've had the floor for more than anyone else who's sat around this table
Only
today.
because you don't know how to rule, Mr. Chair.
Oh, I know how to rule, and you'll find out pretty soon if you keep talking to me.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kellaway.
Okay, so I'm going to come in, used to ump baseball, so I'm going to come in and just see if we can get, no, I'm not going to call strikes or anything like that. I think what we need is, let's collect ourselves here. So listening to what Mr. Perkins is saying, listening to what you're saying, my understanding too is that you have told us that you're also willing to hear, to see written documents as well based on the verbal items that Mr. Perkins has put forward. I think it's time to move forward. If not, we should, I think, let the witnesses, as much as I don't want to see them go, I think we need to be respectful of their time and try to find another avenue by which to have them back. I know things are tight, but I think we need to kind of, we have to kind of land the plane on this one right now. Bye-bye.
Ms. Barron.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of things. First thing is, it is frustrating that we are not hearing from our witnesses right now. I will agree with that sentiment. I also would like to express my concern of the ways in which my colleague, Mr. Perkins, is being responded to by the chair. I do not feel that many of the comments that are being made are appropriate. I also agree that it does clearly state that the member is able to express his concern around the point of privilege. He's made it very clear that he's trying to get through it quickly. I know he's trying to respond to a couple of the questions that I had asked directly around whether there are other organizations within this group of organizations that are not included, which I have not heard. I understand the process. I've read the book. I don't need somebody to explain that to me. My question was more around some of the information for me to be able to determine how I feel on the situation. And so I have some concerns around the way that this process is unfolding. And quite frankly, I do agree that my colleague, Mr. Perkins, has not been heard with his final comments. And I feel like this could have been completely avoided if the process was taken differently. I feel like we would have been talking to witnesses at this point. So I'm just expressing frustration, and my hope is that we can have less comments being made through this decision-making process that are not helpful to the situation.
Thank you for that. Mr. Perkins, I'll allow the committee vote on your challenge to the chair.
Okay, 116(2)A. Unless a time limit has been adopted by the committee or by the House, the chair of a standing, a special, or legislative committee may not bring a debate to an end while there are members present who still wish to participate. A decision of the chair in this regard may not be subject to an appeal of the committee. You've broken Standing Order 116(2)A.
I won't respond to you right now. So I'll ask the clerk to go to the vote, please.
Ms. Koutrakis.
Excuse me.
Oh, sorry.
Frame the question. What?
This is to challenge the decision of the chair to say yes is sustain the decision. So we stop debate and go to witnesses. If you say no, we come back to debate on the motion of privilege. Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway.
Yes.
Ms. Koutrakis.
Oui.
Mr. Weiler. Mr. Hardy.
Yes.
Mr. Morrissey. Yes. Mr. Arnold.
No.
Mr. Bragdon.
No.
Mr. Perkins.
No.
Mr. Small.
No.
Madame Desbiens. No. Ms. Barron.
No.
6 nays, 5 yeas. Now we go back to debate.
Back to debate. Mr. Arnold.
I had provided the points that I wanted to say, that the chair is to hear from the member raising the point of privilege.
Yeah. Mr. Perkins,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
you're more than welcome.
Mr. Chair, MP Barron raised a couple of procedural questions in her opening response, which I'd like an opportunity to respond to clarify the issue. One of the questions she asked is, why is the word potential in the motion? And the word potential is because this committee cannot determine a breach of a privilege. Only the Speaker can. And I will quote page 1060, chapter 20 from Boston Gagnon, where it says, the chair of committee does not have the power to rule on a question of privilege. Only the Speaker has the power. The chair goes on and then says, the chair determines whether the question raised relates to parliamentary privilege. If the chair determines that the question does relate to parliamentary privilege, the committee may then consider presenting a report or question to the House. The report should clearly describe the situation, summarize the facts, provides the names of the people involved, if applicable, state that there may be a breach of privilege, and ask the House to take such measures as it deems appropriate. Ordinarily, presentation of a report to the House is a prerequisite for any question of privilege arising from the proceedings of the committee. So that is, MP Barron, the outline overall, so why it says potential and why the chair itself and the committee doesn't have the power to breach or to determine privilege, but they have the ability to determine whether it is a question that should be proposed to the Speaker. It then goes on to say, with regard in Boston Gagnon about committees, there are no specific rules governing the nature of questions which may be put to witnesses appearing before the committees beyond general requirement of relevance to the issue. My questions in estimates were about enforcement, which was relevant to the time. 443 says witnesses must answer all questions which the committee puts to them. And 444, a witness may object to a question asked by an individual of the committee. However, if the committee agrees that the question be put to the witness, he or she is obliged to reply. Members have been urged to display appropriate courtesy and fairness when questioning witnesses. So the question I posed was around the issue of enforcement, and the minister chose to reply. And the minister's reply was, as I've said earlier, that she began this with enforcement. MP Morrissey said he couldn't discern what was in her mind, and I agree that's an impossibility. But what is possible is to determine whether or not the minister and or the department had engaged in that consultation. And the minister represents both those, and she said she had consulted. All the letters and evidence from the fishing groups clearly indicate that neither the minister nor the department had reached out and answered MP Morrissey's question. It wasn't a question that she was reflecting on whether or not somebody else in her department had done the consultation with these groups. In fact, these groups have said that neither the department nor the minister did that. So I think that's answered MP Barron's procedural questions. It's our job, if raised, to then prepare a report, which the clerks do, and I will give all these letters to the analysts and the clerk for them to look at as part of their discussion of this point of privilege. And when the minister said that she began this consultation or began this situation by consulting with individual fishing associations, that was misleading the committee because neither she nor the department had done that. The evidence is clear. And I ask that this committee and the chair be impartial when he looks at this and looks at the evidence and makes an appropriate report back to the House that there has been this breach of privilege. And a breach of privilege is that ministers have to tell the truth before committee. And this minister did not. This minister did not. And there's no language barrier to it. That's a lame excuse for a very simple question about consultation and enforcement. She had translation. The translation is clear. Her response is clear. And her response was that she began with consultation. And she didn't begin, she didn't start in the middle, and she never ended, and to this date hasn't had consultation with any of the maritime fishing groups on the Bay of Fundy enforcement, neither her nor her department. So that evidence, Mr. Chair, and those letters from those groups we will share with you, share with the clerk, so that you can make your ruling. And your ruling only is if there was a potential, if the question was in order. The chair's ruling is not whether there's been a point of privilege, just whether or not the question of misleading the committee is a point of privilege. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. And Madame Debienne.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. I have two things to say. First of all, I totally agree that sometimes we receive evasive answers from the minister.
Translation, and there's no sound even coming through my earpiece. Whether it's a bad one. I'll try another one.
On peut...
Hang on.
Can the chairperson hear the interpreter now? Okay, thank you.
No.
I will repeat. I realize as well that sometimes we do receive evasive answers from witnesses, be it the minister or other public servants. And on the ground, I've also received information from people saying it is false, we were not consulted. So I agree with my colleagues on this side. What I would like to highlight, first of all, is thank the witnesses who are present, who took time to come and testify. We need to put them back on the timetable. That is fundamental. Secondly, I would like to highlight the fact that there's a difference between denouncing that situation and engaging in another process that our neighbors have taken us onto, that is on ending privilege in the House of Commons that is paralyzing our work. So let's be clear and consistent. Let's do things the right way. We should have more trust in we need the trust of our electors who voted for us to resolve their problems. There are problems with fisheries. In Quebec, it's the same thing. There's lack of consultation. People don't listen to them. Many witnesses said that many times. So in that regard, that problem needs to be resolved. And if we need to go there, we'll do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to follow along what Ms. Dabian said, and I think what has been said thus far, it's important that this gets established and has full vetting and is able to be determined, because those who are expecting the work of the committee to produce results, they know in order for there to be good results, good outcomes, accurate reporting recommendations, there has to be total transparency and open and honest answers coming from the witnesses that are before us, and most in particular, the minister herself. It's incumbent that we do reestablish or establish a confidence in answers that are being given. And Mr. Perkins is doing his job as an MP to stand up and fight for those stakeholders, fish harvesters, and organizations in his region. They send us here to represent the concerns of our constituents. And Mr. Perkins, as he's borne witness to here, has had repeated conversations with key stakeholders and industry representatives that are telling him they were absolutely frustrated and flabbergasted with what they heard. And he's given air to that. And he's doing his job in making sure their voices are being heard on this matter here at the Committee for Fisheries and Oceans. And the seriousness of it is that when people look to the committee and they want to have some semblance of confidence that what we're doing matters and that we're taking it seriously, is that if there's been a complete breach like this, or what we feel to be a complete breach, that there are repercussions for that, and that we're willing to do whatever we got to do to make sure that the transparent answers that are expected are being given. The minister has an obligation, not just to this committee, not just to the member that asked the question, but to every Canadian, and most importantly, to those whose industries and livelihoods depend upon all of us getting it right here. That's why this question is important. And as important as all the other things that we're going to be doing, as they are, and all the other hearings and witnesses we want to hear from, and it's all important and good work, if we don't get this right, it erodes the confidence in the whole process. It erodes the confidence in anything we're going to recommend going forward, because they're going to say, how can we trust the testimony if we don't have absolute assurance? So this is, in fact, I think, a worthy exercise in establishing the merits and the importance of having accurate, honest, transparent testimony that when a member raises questions on behalf of his or her constituents, they have absolute surety that whoever's given that answer, and most in particular the minister responsible for the file, that they're being transparent and honest with it. So, Mr. Chair, I appreciate you taking the time and considering this, and I appreciate the deliberations that's going on. And I think it's important that those at home understand that we take very seriously a concern that's raised by one of our members who feels like his constituents were totally misrepresented, and that their concerns are going to be heard when they feel that way. And so Mr. Perkins doing the job of an elected official to represent those in his riding, especially on a matter that does pertain to their future livelihoods. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it.
Mr. Reynolds, and then Mr. Small.
Who was first?
You.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the point of privilege being raised is, because we've just finally come to a head with this. I recall back to studies back in the 42nd Parliament, and the issue around St. Mary's Bay came up, and we first learned about it because of the MPA, or the protective process that was put in place through consultation and agreement with the harvesters in the area to protect the spawning and breeding areas of the lobster in that area. That had taken place because of proper consultation, which is what the minister alluded to, but clearly has not happened from the evidence that Mr. Perkins has provided so far, and he says he'll be providing more. But I also want to relate to further studies we did on the smallmouth bass that this committee did, and the treatment of smallmouth bass in the Miramichi. I recall having department officials in, and one of them stating that we could not use rotenone in Canada anymore. I knew at the time, and I probably should have raised it as a point of privilege at that time, that rotenone was being used in Canada to treat water systems for aquatic invasive species. But it's just another case of where I believe the privilege of these committee members, and I say all committee members on all sides of the House, when we are misled by testimony either by witnesses, more so by department representatives, and at worst, the minister herself. It is something that we cannot tolerate. We cannot do our work as a standing committee if we cannot trust the information that is provided to us, and it's a reflection on if we are being given misleading information, what do the stakeholders, the harvesters, and the communities that rely on the fisheries, what faith can they have in the ministers to manage that department in their best interests? So this whole process that Mr. Perkins has raised, I think it's just been something that's been boiling under the surface for an extended period of time. And as I say, I go back to the 42nd Parliament of cases that should have probably been brought up at that time, but we're now finally getting to raise these issues now. So I hope that you will take this after you've heard the presentation of the information. I hope you will take this and determine that it has the potential to be a point of privilege and raise it to the Speaker with the report from this committee. Thank you.
Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I echo Mr. Arnold's comments. And to have a minister come before this committee again and again, she's been here a couple of times, and to answer questions off talking points and giving the same answer for every question is despicable. And the industry wants better. It's no wonder that they've lost they've lost faith in this Minister number 6. So I just hope, I'm hoping that you being a good Newfoundlander and Labradorian and quite some respect within the industry, you'll make the right decision, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Small, that's it. So we can suspend the switch out panels, I guess. So much for what?
Because I think there's a witness here. I don't know if she's first or second. Is she second panel?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We'll suspend for a moment while we switch out. I apologise to the witnesses that have been online and unable to give their statements and whatnot for whatever, or answer any questions, but hopefully we can get in a written submission from each of you and include that in our deliberations. Our second panel, we have on Zoom Gideon Mordecai, Research Associate, Institute for Oceans and Fisheries from the University of British Columbia. And we also have Jess Zeman, Executive Director of the BC Wildlife Federation, and Sonia Strobel, Co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of Skipper Otto Community Supported Fishery, here in the room. Good to have you. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. Mr. Mordecai, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm a research associate at the University of British Columbia, working on the health and disease of Pacific salmon, and I'm here today to speak on behalf of the scientific process and the critical role of evidence-based science in decision-making and shaping good policy. The Fisheries Act describes scientific information as one of the key considerations for decision-making. However, concerns about industrial and political interference undermining scientific integrity at DFO have been raised by First Nations, academics, NGOs, and the DFO Scientists Union. While there are many excellent scientists within DFO carrying out world-class research, it's the structural processes for reviewing and summarizing science that can be the issue. DFO's internal science advice has diverged from international scientific consensus on certain issues, and the Fisheries Minister and other decision makers can receive advice portrayed as science, yet it isn't evidence-based, impartial, or independently reviewed, essential components of trustworthy, high-quality scientific practice. A paper I co-authored last year used salmon aquaculture in BC as a case study to examine this phenomenon. In the paper, we described how DFO science was captured by industry. Data implicating the industry and harm to wild salmon was repeatedly pushed aside. Key papers were suppressed, and DFO's own scientists were silenced. DFO claims that the CSAS review process is gold standard. Yet it allows industry stakeholders to influence risk assessments concerning their own impacts on wild salmon. All in all, these problems mean that DFO continues to assess some of the pathogens that I study, like Piscinorthoreovirus and Tenacibaculum, as not causing disease or not posing a risk, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Another example was last year's CSAS report on sea lice. The report's authors cherry-picked their results to suit their narrative, ignored a huge body of pre-existing evidence, and then had the report externally reviewed by one industry-associated professor to sign off on it. In order to fix these kind of issues, our paper recommends the establishment of an independent scientific body. This body would provide credible fisheries science advice to decision makers. And it's a suggestion that's been made numerous times in the past by other senior fishery scientists. There are numerous examples of these types of independent science advice bodies, both within Canada and internationally. For example, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, known as CSIWC. But when it comes to fishery science advice, Canada's lagging behind international standards. Science needs to be just science, based on evidence and free of political and economic influence. This will ultimately help to rebuild trust in DFO decision-making and guard against regulatory capture. In our paper, we identified key features for the independent body to uphold, which I'll submit in writing, but they include a strict conflict of interest policy, editorial independence, and freedom of scientific inquiry. I'd also like to take a moment to highlight the precautionary principle, a key concept that emphasizes the importance of caution. It underscores that the absence of scientific certainty should not be used as an excuse to delay action that could prevent serious harm to fish or their ecosystems. Take, for example, the study of how diseases impact wild fish populations. It's pretty rare to identify a clear, definitive cause and effect relationship, what you might call a smoking gun. Yet, when fish populations are in critical decline, it's crucial to act with precaution. Decisions made under these circumstances can be the difference between recovery and collapse. Finally, I want to emphasize the need for greater transparency in the science that is used in decision-making. Increased openness would allow external scientists to assess the quality and relevance of the advice being applied. And while it's understandable that economic and social considerations play a significant role in these decisions, they should be weighed alongside the science, not used to influence the interpretation of the science itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to Mr. Zeman for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee for the opportunity to speak again. I won't give you the refresher on the BC Wildlife Federation because we've been here a number of times in the past. This year, the BC Wildlife Federation and its partners restored over 350 hectares of wetlands and streams, conducted a number of salmon habitat restoration projects, installed 71 beaver dam analogs, and over the past 2 years, we helped remove nearly 45,000 kilograms of garbage from the Fraser River tidal marsh. Our partners include First Nations, ENGOs, local communities, private landholders, the Government of Canada, and the province BC. The 2019 modernization of the Fisheries Act provided a number of positive amendments, particularly around rebuilding plans, alteration and destruction of habitat, environmental flow needs, and return of the HAD provision. However, the application of the Fisheries Act is perhaps more important than the Fisheries Act itself. In the world of conservation, the future of salmon is dependent upon outcomes, not process. This year, for Fraser River sockeye, we had the second lowest return on record, with a final in-season estimate of 456,000 fish, 100,000 less than what was originally predicted. With the second lowest return on record, one would expect additional enforcement efforts to protect this dismal return. However, Pacific Salmon Commission data indicates that legal fisheries, such as test fisheries and food, social, and ceremonial, caught just over 6,100 fish. The United States, our treaty partner, reported 0 fish caught, and in addition to that, Canada reported 15,000 plus sockeye in what DFO calls other fisheries. DFO defines other fisheries as fisheries that may include unauthorized directed retention or unauthorized bycatch retention in fisheries directed at other species. 15,000 fish is an underestimate, as those numbers are primarily from fisheries managers, not fisheries officers. We know this because fisheries officers were virtually non-existent on the Mid-Fraser. On the Mid-Fraser, DFO enforcement spent 1,000 hours patrolling in 2022. And in the past, it was 1,000 more than that. This year, it was around 100 hours. To my knowledge, there were no night operations nor helicopter operations on the Mid-Fraser, but there were a number of reports of poaching. In November 2023, we spoke to the committee about illegal, unregulated, and unreported catch and similar issues within DFO. A number of fisheries officers who were passionate about fish conservation have now left compliance and conservation and protection entirely, or left DFO, and some have left the Canadian government recently to go work for the province. Additionally, a number of managers in the conservation and protection part of DFO come from the Canada Border Services Agency. This has eliminated advancement opportunities for DFO staff, but more importantly, it puts those who know very little about fisheries, conservation, and protection in charge of enforcement. As said in November 2023, I believe the committee has a number of questions to ask DFO Conservation and Protection around historical data related to officers on leave, turnover, the number of night patrols, helicopter, and boat patrols on both the lower and mid-Fraser River over the past 5 years. This will give the committee a better temperature check on the changing effectiveness and culture within conservation and protection. The number of fisheries officers in Lillooet, Williams Lake, Quesnel, and Prince George is now less than half of what it was in 2011. Without enforcement, the Fisheries Act is merely a paper tagger. Thanks for your time, and there are similar issues as it relates to quagga and zebra mussels as well as whirling disease.
This first time somebody left me a minute on the clock.
I watched what happened before this, so I figured I'd cut off some time.
Appreciate that very much. We'll now go to Ms. Strobel for 5 minutes or less, please.
Well, thank you so much. So grateful to be here in person for this review of the Fisheries Act. It's a powerful tool for shaping how all Canadians benefit from the richness of our vast coastlines and our abundant fisheries resources. My name is Sonia Strobel, and I've come to you today from my home on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people in Vancouver, BC. And I'm honored to bring to you the perspectives of my extensive networks of West Coast harvesters, shoreside businesses, academics, environmental NGOs, and seafood consumers. So I've been here before, but I'll introduce myself. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Skipper Auto Community-Supported Fishery. It's an innovative way for Canadians to buy seafood directly from Canadian fishing families. Our network of 45 fish harvesters in BC and in Nunavut provides seafood directly to some 8,000 member families across 5 provinces from Victoria to Montreal through a unique subscription model. Since founding Skipper Auto 16 years ago, I've dedicated my life's work to protecting a small-scale fishing way of life in Canada's coastal and Indigenous communities, and to building a robust local seafood system that ensures Canadians have access to Canadian seafood. In addition to my work at Skipper Auto, I'm a member of the Fisheries for Communities Network, which is a grassroots movement working to ensure that the many values of BC fisheries flow to the people on the water and on the dock and in adjacent communities. I'm on the executive committee of the Local Catch Network based out of the University of Maine, which is a hub for knowledge exchange and innovation to support local community-based seafood systems in North America. And in 2023, I co-founded the Local Catch Canada Network. It's expanding our work at Local Catch and centering Indigenous knowledge holders to build an equitable community-based seafood system within the uniquely Canadian context. I'm a mentor to many small-scale fishing businesses in Canada and the U.S., and I often speak on these topics to media and at conferences like the BC Salmon Recovery and Resilience Conference in Vancouver last week that was hosted by the Pacific Salmon Foundation and the First Nations Council of Canada, First Nations Fisheries Council. So in preparation for my appearance, I've consulted with members of these many networks, and I've done my best to synthesize what I've heard from them and to bring that to you today. So the most common and consistent refrain that I hear from my networks is that the true value of our fisheries lies in how the bounty of our oceans enriches our communities, socially, economically, culturally, and as a food source. That the health and well-being of our oceans and our fish and our ecosystems and our people are inextricably linked. So when you prioritize the protection of a way of life of the people who live and work on the water in our fisheries, you're necessarily supporting the objectives of the Act. That is, protecting fish and fish habitat, advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and ensuring the long-term sustainability of marine resources. Modernization to the Act in 2018-2019 began to address the inequities that it continues to perpetuate, but the realities on the ground for fishing communities and businesses like mine and seafood consumers have actually only gotten worse. So if time allows during the question period, I'd be happy to provide some specific and current examples of how members of my community are harmed by the lack of protections in the Act for active fish harvesters and everyday Canadians. But for now, I'll just briefly highlight 3 things that this review of the Act could undertake to address if we're to address the inequities that are continuing. So first of all, the Act should define its own purpose at the outset. And the courts have consistently upheld that the social, cultural, and economic and food system benefits are the purview of the Act. So regular reviews of the Act should help ensure that the protection and equitable distribution of those benefits to Canadians, especially those who live and work in fishing communities and on the water actively harvesting. Secondly, the Act should enshrine fleet separation and owner-operator protections in all of Canada, not just on the inshore fleets in the maritime provinces and Quebec. And the Act should ensure that the minister's discretion does not override her obligation to take into consideration social, economic, and cultural factors. So my written brief provides specific sections of the Act that I believe could be changed to meet these outcomes. But time is of the essence. With every new minister, it seems that we're back to square one, trying to cut through the noise and trying to convince her why protecting active harvesters in our coastal and Indigenous communities is important and is in her power. With an election looming, It's more important than ever that we wrap up all the years of study on this topic and finally enshrine into the Act the protections that we need for the people who live, work, and fish in our coastal and Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Right on the mark for the 5 minutes. That was good. We'll now move to our first round of questioning. First, we'll have Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before you start my time, could I ask the clerk if there's a possibility to get extended resources so we can get a full hour with these witnesses?
We want the Commissioner, the Chair, to extend as well, so that's hardly going to happen today.
Not happening, okay.
No.
Okay, thank you. I will start with Mr. Zeman, if I could, please. Mr. Zeman, you mentioned the changes in the Act. Some were good, but results were more important than process. Could you elaborate a little further on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. And so this ties into the lack of enforcement. On the mid-Fraser, we did reach out to DFO and asked, and we got a messaged response back why there was no enforcement. I mean, there's parallels around the world of whirling disease and invasive mussels. We have laws that say you can't transport whirling disease or aquatic invasives, but we know that there's no protection around our borders to keep them out. And I can also report, and a number of the committee members probably don't know what whirling disease is. Very long story short, it's a parasite that affects salmonids. It can get into their spinal column, and they essentially get a kink in their tail or in their body, and they swim around in circles until they die. BC just reported 3 positives yesterday or on Friday in Kootenay Lake. So I guess the point of that is we can have all of the laws that we think will change the outcome and take care of fish. But if we have no enforcement of those laws, the laws don't mean anything. And, BC is one of the few places left in Canada that currently does not have quagga and zebra mussels. And until last year, we didn't have whirling disease. And quite frankly, DFO on both fronts has been nowhere to be found.
Are you saying that the enforcement or the inspection of watercraft or waterborne vessels or tools or implements is lacking and putting our BC waters at risk?
Yes, from our perspective, no watercraft should enter BC without being inspected and decontaminated and possibly quarantined. DFO did provide $400,000 a year to the program, to the Mussel Defense Program until 2023. This year, there was no money provided federally. The BCWF partnered with the Pacific Salmon Foundation as well as the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation to try to provide some, bare minimum funding. I believe DFO did buy a couple of trailers. From our perspective, again, we have federal regulations that prohibit the transportation of these invasives. But if there's no money and there's no enforcement of these laws, BC is going to end up with mussels, and we now have whirling disease in 2 places.
Okay, thank you. We're doing a review of the changes to the 2019 to the Fisheries Act in 2019. Are the tools in place within that act to implement the enforcement and inspection and so on, or are there changes needed in the act?
Enforcement, it's a regulation, aquatic invasive species underneath the Fisheries Act. So I would say yes, the legislative and regulatory tools are there. What's missing is funding and capacity to actually make sure that those things don't happen.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order.
Yes, Ms. Brown.
I'm so sorry to interrupt our valued witnesses, and it is for that reason that I am calling a point of order. The time with our witnesses is so important. We have many questions that we want to be able to ask them, and it's for that reason I do want to challenge the chair's decision to not request the clerk seek additional resources for us to have the full hour.
The clerk is checking to see if there is extra time available, but that's not saying it'll go ahead.
No, I understand that. Okay. The sorry, Chair, just to continue, the information that I just heard you say was that you were not going to be looking into additional resources. So I'm happy to hear that the clerk is checking. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Continue on, Mr. Arnold.
Thank you. I'll go to Ms. Strobel for a few minutes. Good to see you here again. committee did a study on owner-operator and vessel licensing on the West Coast in 2019. We revisited that again in last year. Action had been very slow. Can you say where there could be changes in the Act or within the regulations under the Act that would move that process along?
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. This committee's been studying the topic of owner-operator and fleet separation for many years, and reports in 2019 and 2023 were very clear about recommendations for changes that needed to be made. And so we are still hoping to see those changes. There's very little progress, very little actual work is being done. There was another study, yet another study. So, Lindsay Gardner, who's working very hard, but Lindsay Gardner is again asking the questions about, should we undertake reforms in the Pacific region, and holding roundtables and asking the same questions that we've been asking and have been presented to this committee for 6 years. Instead, what she should be asking is how should we modernize West Coast fisheries policy? And this time could be, taxpayer dollars could be so much better put to use if there was simply a ministerial order that said, the decision's been made, we are moving to owner-operator on the Pacific region. Now we can start the conversation about how. We've been asked in the community to present how could it look for different fisheries, but that's like asking us to do the homework when it hasn't been decided that it's going to happen. So there'd be much more creative energy put toward it if that decision was made. So as relates to the Act, Section 2.5 talks about the...
Could I ask you to put that submit that in writing? I have one more question I want to try and fit in here for Mr. Zeman.
Absolutely.
Mr. Zeman, do the purposes listed in the Fisheries Act adequately address the conservation of fisheries, fish stocks for commercial and recreational use, do you feel, or should the purposes be modified?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, and I don't know if I'll be able to give you a perfect answer for it. There is definitely a sentiment or a concern around public access to things like fish and nature generally. There's probably improvements to be made, but specific targets that I can give you, I wouldn't be able to provide them today.
Okay, if you can provide us anything in writing, we would appreciate that. And I see the chair is preoccupied, so I'm going to carry on. Ms. Strobel, anything that you would like to add on that? Are there components in the purposes of the Act that are missing or should be added?
As they relate specifically to the conservation of fish stocks? Sorry, can you rephrase that question?
Conservation or the sustainability of fisheries.
I think the written remarks that I've provided are specifically as that relates to the protection of the socioeconomic and cultural factors in fisheries. So I've got those comments there specifically.
I'm sorry, Mr. Arnold, your time is up, has gone well over. We'll go on now to Mr. Weiler for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I do want to thank our witness for being here in person and our witnesses joining virtually by video conference as well. I do want to start with Mr. Zeman. It's great to see you on committee, although some very alarming facts that you mentioned. The fact that there's less than half of the fisheries officers now that there was in 2011. I remember in my riding in 2012 when the DFO office was shut down by the Harper government on the Sunshine Coast. I remember several years later there was an effort to shut down the DFO office in Squamish. And I think we're seeing an overall centralization of DFO services. And I think you quite accurately pointed out some of the concerns that leads to IUU fishing in different places. I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit more to that, as well as if you see any mechanisms or opportunities to also maybe better utilize technology and data in some of those detection and enforcement efforts as well.
Yeah. So yes, we are seeing, a lack of officers. We're seeing kind of a brain drain happen. People heading to other parts of the Canadian government, and people leaving. Like I said, there's people leaving that are coming to work for the province and working for the Conservation Officer Service. And so, the challenge with people who love fish and wildlife is they do it not because you make more or you get a better paycheck or it's a better job. They actually sacrifice those things because they're so passionate about the resource. And, sometimes you see this, we're seeing it provincially too, where there's some pretty serious issues around morale because there's a lack of funding. And so how do we change that? I think part of it would be, what would be interesting is I know that BC definitely per capita, we have more fisheries, we have a bigger rec fishery, we have more Indigenous communities, we have more species at risk probably than every other place to the east of us. And per capita, we definitely have far fewer fisheries officers. So some kind of commitment to go, look, what do we need? Like, what do we need? How many people do we need? As opposed to this kind of makeshift approach where when we have budget cuts, it's a matter of priorities. And our priority is fish and fish conservation. Around technology, the BCWF actually built a tool called the Conservation app. We need to update it, but it was gave citizen scientists the ability to basically report infractions on their phones. And a bit of a backstory, when we started putting this to use, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I know that DFO was opposed to it because they were worried they would be overwhelmed by the number of reports because they wouldn't be able to respond to them because there weren't enough people. So is the technology there? Yes, absolutely. I think as it relates to enforcement, the big picture is funding, capacity, and then outcomes. And I think, the folks, it's hard on all of us when people who are fisheries officers, biologists, managers who care so passionately about the resource go, I can't even do my job. I'm not allowed to leave the office. I can't travel, all those sorts of things. So, there's a big picture, and I think, maybe there's some time that DFO can spend looking at what's an appropriate level. But I know there have been multiple commissions. Every single commission that comes up, it always says there aren't enough enforcement officers. Sometimes you get a bit of a bump, which fades off over time.
Thank you very much for that. Next question I want to ask to Dr. Mordecai. You mentioned, you spoke about the need to establish an independent science body to be able to provide advice for decision makers. And some of the examples of what we already have in Canada and perhaps in other countries as well. I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit more about that, and particularly how that might be able to fit into legislative changes to the Fisheries Act, so that there can have it could have perhaps proper guidelines or direction to ensure that it does meet those qualities that you mentioned.
Thanks for the question. I'm not a scholar of how policy is made legally, but what I can provide, we can talk about other examples within Canada and why it's so important, and some of the really big issues, like the example of how vaccines are reviewed for public safety. It's something which is all about trust, and to get that trust, there's a body which has this really strict conflict of interest policy, so that people can trust the information they're receiving. And I think something analogous needs to happen for fisheries, because right now that trust isn't there. One of our key features of our independent body that we do kind of recommend would be some sort of legislative basis that makes sure that science advice from an independent body is enshrined in law, and that's as one input to the decision making. Exactly how that would look, I'm not sure, but I looking at the Fisheries Act. It does state that science is one of the considerations when it comes to decision making. So maybe it's kind of similar to some of the other issues you've heard today, where it's more of like an implementation gap of making sure that science is of good enough quality and is provided, rather than it not being in the law itself.
Thank you. And maybe as an add-on to that, you also spoke about the precautionary principle. And do you see the need to, in any way, provide any guidelines that will be considered in decision making, and also more definition of what that process needs to be like in that decision making?
Your time has expired, Mr. Weiler, so I would ask Mr. Mordecai if he could respond in writing to the committee, please, on that question. We'll now go to Madam Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. Their presence is always well appreciated. Thank you for your competence. Mr. Mordecai, A while ago, you talked about key sections that were deleted, scientific sections. And you also mentioned that we must reestablish trust. And that starts with some sort of scientific mediation. Ms. Morissette, Dr. Morissette recently came here. Maybe you know her or not. She works mostly in the East, and she said the same thing, that there must be, horizontally speaking, a non-partisan organ that brings together independent scientists and scientists from DFO to come with clear, non-partisan guidance for the government. And this should be done as a matter of urgency. We are going through an important crisis throughout all territories. So we need such an organ which would kind of leave aside politics from the exercise. Politics should only be involved to implement decisions following the environmental mediation taken by this organ. What do you think about this?
Yeah, and that's something we thought about when we put together our paper. Like, it uses salmon agriculture in BC as a case study, but we see these same issues across the board, and I think it makes the work of the decision makers within DFO really difficult if they can't necessarily trust the information they're receiving. And so while on paper sometimes things look okay in terms of how DFO have their science advice, it doesn't always work out the case. And so this isn't just like a few isolated cases. There's this kind of structural issue with how science is handled, which is why we came to the recommendation of a body which was independent kind of from political and bureaucracy kind of influence. And like, you know, I use the example of Kasiwik because I think overall it kind of has the respect and trust of the public in the science and the work that's done there. You know, and I've spoken to some of the chairs of that body, and it's kind of because of the kind of conflict of interest policy and what they're there to do. They know they're just there to review the science. I mean, there's these kind of stops and process involved to make sure that the kind of bureaucracy and the political influence doesn't get involved in that process.
Merci, c'est très éclairant. Madame Strobel.
Thank you, Ms. Strobel. I was listening to you and I thought of an organization in Quebec called Marche dans Saint-Laurent, which adopts the same approach. I think there are even similarities when it comes to supply management for agriculture. So this principle to rebalance consumption with fish harvesting, to give back to the community the produce from fisheries as a priority, that was also raised at a colloquium organized by the Bloc Québécois. It was apolitical, but it was initiated by the Bloc Québécois. And the same observation was made that more than 95% of our produce are very high quality, but exported. So we need that. We do need trade. The fish harvesters need to be profitable. We understand that. But in principle, priority should be given to local consumption for the coastal regions where there's fishing. It's not always the case in Quebec. And what I understand is that you are also asking for that. So tell me, what do you think should be added to the Act? A recommendation with an obligation for the department to state an intention that Quebec consumers be prioritized when it comes to their produce, and that there should be some balance between demand and supply before we think about exporting. Do you like this proposal?
Yes, thank you very much for those comments. I think we see very similar things in fisheries in Canada that we export. Around 90% of the seafood that we catch in Canada and about 80% of what we eat in Canada is imported seafood. And we know that that comes from fisheries that are not as well managed as ours, where the water isn't as clean, where we don't have labor laws to protect workers. And so Canadian consumers should be benefiting, should be nourishing their bodies from the bounty of our oceans. I don't see much or anything in the Fisheries Act that looks at fish as nutrition for Canadians. This is, I think, an oversight. I think it comes from a colonial history where we've thought about our resources as products to extract and benefit someone far away. We have not thought about the bounty of this land is for the people here. And so I agree, we lack protections in the Act that look at fisheries as a food source for Canadians. And so I think that protecting harvesters, so putting the power into the hands of harvesters to have agency over where they're selling their catch would go a long way to feeding Canadians. Whereas if the vast majority of our licenses and quotas are owned by large export-oriented companies or foreign entities, then we've given up our resource before we have even given Canadians the opportunity to nourish themselves with that fish. And so I think that this is absolutely the purview of this Act to protect our fish in the waters for Canadians, not only to harvest and benefit from, but also to nourish ourselves all across the country.
Thank you, Madam Debbie N. A little bit over time. We'll go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Ms. Strobel, Dr. Mordecai, and Mr. Zeman once again. It's nice to see all three of you. I have lots of questions, so I'm going to try to get through this fairly quickly and efficiently. My first question is to you, Ms. Strobel. Could you, as you mentioned in your opening statement, provide us with some of the ways in which members of your community are harmed by the lack of protections in the Act for active fish harvesters and everyday Canadians, but perhaps maybe just narrow it down to one?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll give you one quick example. One of the harvesters in our community just spoke with Mr. Kellaway recently, on Friday actually, about the fact that right now he's waiting to head out on a halibut fishing trip. 77.5% of the landed value of that catch will go to the license owner, to the license holder. That's before he can even pay for the cost of his trip, his crew, and hopefully pay himself. This fall, the license holder has postponed his trip and postponed it and postponed it again. He's waiting at the docks. He can't go fishing because the license owner is still negotiating for the best deal, which in theory will benefit this harvester somewhat. But this harvester sits at the dock, penniless, unable to go fishing because he doesn't own access to the resource. This is a kind of modern feudal system where he is an indentured worker, has absolutely no agency and no power. And I think it's unthinkable, it's unconscionable that we continue to allow this to happen on the West Coast, particularly when we've implemented changes, regulations, laws on the East Coast to prevent this from happening in other parts of Canada. Why do we allow this to continue on the West Coast?
That's a really important example. Thank you so much, Ms. Strobel. I'm going to come back to you, but I am going to move to Dr. Mordecai. Dr. Mordecai, you talked about the precautionary principle. And one of the things I hear over and over again in the community, talking to various people about open net fish farms, is the rationale to either delay action or to justify action not being taken based on the fact that I hear from people having concerns that there's inconclusive science. And so my question is, how does the precautionary principle, how does it, that argument contradict directly with the responsibility of the minister to move forward with the precautionary principle?
Yeah, and I think when it comes to complicated scientific questions, there's lots going on. There's lots of different stresses. So there's a few ways to answer this. One is that this is one stressor and there is evidence, there is some risk. So if you remove it, you're making a precautionary decision. The other kind of example of the precautionary principle is when it comes to just looking at individual pieces of evidence. And in terms of, I often see it in my work, DFO won't assess some of the diseases we study as disease agents because there's not a causal relationship with disease on a population. Sometimes the bar set so high by DFO, the level of evidence they require, it's something that's actually almost impossible to know if it's having a population effect with 100% certainty. So that's why the precautionary principle is so important. It's because you don't always have that level of certainty, but we have to make these important decisions about populations which in some cases are in these severe states of decline.
Thank you, Dr. Mordecai. I'm going to move back to you, Ms. Strobel. In your in the final pieces of your opening statement, which was right on time today, you had mentioned in point number 3 around the act should ensure that the minister's discretion does not override her obligation to take into consideration social, economic, and cultural factors. Can you expand a little bit more on that and why that's important?
Yeah, I mean, the Act currently, the way that it's worded in Section 2.5 says that the minister may consider, among other things. And in that is listed under G, social, economic, and cultural factors in the management of fisheries, and also the preservation or promotion of the independence of license holders in commercial inshore fleets. And so there's a few problems there. First, indicating that she may consider these is not strong enough wording. And so I think it makes it difficult. I think it makes the minister nervous. It makes the department nervous to make bold decisions because the acting is vague. So I think that wording should embolden them to say will or must consider those things. And then also this wording about the independence of license holders in commercial inshore fisheries. This language is often used by the department to say that this only applies to the East Coast. And so that language needs to be changed. Although Minister LeBlanc at the time said that this, the use of the word promotion of independent license holders made it also apply to the West Coast. In actual practice on the grounds, it's not being used in that way. And so I think specifically the Act needs to make very clear that the minister's responsibility is to consider these things always, and that these things apply to the West Coast as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I only have 30 seconds left, so I'm trying to figure out how to best use that 30 seconds, apparently by just talking about nothing. My last question, and perhaps if I get another round, I'll get you to respond to it then, and I'll just ask it now. But in the first point, you had talked about helping to ensure the protection and equitable distribution of those benefits to Canadians. And my question that I'll get you to respond to, and hopefully my second round, is what is the way in which you see that happening? What is the best way to move us in that direction?
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. First to Mr. Seaman, I heard you mention, Mr. Seaman, funding, capacity, and outcomes. DFO funding is 3 times higher than it was in 2014, and its staff is 50% higher. Why are we not having conservation outcomes, do you think, when conservation is supposed to trump all inside the Fisheries Act?
That's a really good question, and I think it's a matter of priorities. Our priorities as an organization are around the conservation of fish, first of all, and second of all, around access and opportunity. And we definitely struggle with these things. You know, we talked at committee before around pinnipeds. A number of folks gave testimony, and we engaged DFO on that afterwards. And the response from DFO was completely inconsistent with what everybody had said at committee. So, you know, I don't have a good answer for you, but I think the best answer is that the department's priorities might not line up with our priorities.
Yes, on pinnipeds, there was quite a bit of talk for the first couple of years of this Parliament about pinnipeds, and last year in Newfoundland and Labrador, less than 32,000 of a possible harvest of 450,000 were taken. So it's on your coast and in Atlantic Canada as well. It seems to be a lot of lip service. So this summer, DFO had admitted to a lack of patrols. They wouldn't admit on the Atlantic side, but they did admit it on the BC side. So what do you think of the arguments that were made to support their cutting back on their patrols? Do you think that's legitimate arguments, or do you think somebody influenced the PMO for that outcome?
That's a good question. When we asked why there was no enforcement on the Mid-Fraser, the response that we got from DFO was, in order to preserve operational integrity and to maintain strategic flexibility, DFO's Conservation Protection Branch does not provide specific statistics on numbers and frequency of enforcement patrols, etc. CMP program uses a wide range of tools on Canada's fish resources. Using a risk-based intelligence approach, CMP deploys fisheries officers throughout the province to respond to priority issues using a variety of methods, etc. So maybe you got a response, but that was the response we got when we inquired why there were no fisheries officers on the Mid-Fraser this summer and why poaching on the Mid-Fraser on sockeye was rampant. So they didn't even acknowledge that there was a shortage of fisheries officers.
The number one purpose of the Fisheries Act is conservation. Do you think that's the number one priority right now within the current DFO setup?
It doesn't seem that way.
Ms. Strobel, not long ago at the Women of the Year Awards in BC, and congratulations, you came very, very close, and I'm sure your work around this table was a feather in your cap, and keep up the good work. But you said, I think certain voices just haven't been heard. How do you think that applies to the constructing of the current Fisheries Act?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. That consultation right now happens in advisory boards, which are largely made up of license owners. And so we have this perpetuation of the system where the DFO consults with those who own and control access to the resource. And those are, generally speaking, not active harvesters or the people who are working in coastal communities. The more licenses you own, the more say you get. And so this is that self-replicating system. So the Act talks about these advisory boards, and we really need to modernize that so that the department is consulting with people in communities who are actively engaged in harvesting.
So you're saying that the advisory boards are failing because of the composition? Yes, thank you. The composition of the boards. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Strobel, I'd like you to submit something in writing about out of precautionary principles affecting your business.
Mr. Hardy for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mordecai, or Dr. Mordecai, I captured your thoughts about separating science from the DFO. What level of confidence do you have that whoever provides science to the DFO, that it's passed along objectively and in an action-oriented way to the minister?
There's a few ways for me to answer that question. One is, I've reviewed internal science advice within DFO, and I have no confidence in the quality of that. I know that it's not in line with the international science research on those topics. I don't have time to go into details right now. And then this kind of second aspect is, even when I've been involved with work with DFO scientists themselves, I had no confidence that those results would be communicated kind of up the chain towards the minister. And for those reasons, we kind of sought kind of external ways to provide that information. So yeah, the short answer is low confidence. And I do think having an external body might help some of those issues, because you'd cut some of those kind of ladders of the hierarchy where that information might get blocked.
Thank you. Ms. Strobel, we're going to hear from another witness, Jennifer Silver. You probably know her. And she's going to make the point that the Fisheries Act needs to really be more engaged in the whole social and cultural background to the fishery. Do you agree with that? And do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think working with the local catch network in the U.S., I have a lot of contact points with community-based fishers there, and their interaction with their department, NOAA, is very significantly different from in Canada. And I think that stems from the relationship our department has, which is very much a sort of top-down policing, absolute discretion entity. And in the U.S., it feels very different, and that has to do, it comes from things in the Act. And so I agree that, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the ministry, needs to really be looking at the social, cultural ties to fishing in the communities, and that's going to come out of collaboration and true consultation with people in communities and actually listening rather than that kind of top-down dictation that we see.
So I don't know which of you would like to answer this one, but Canada is a big country. We have the North Coast, we have the East Coast, we have the West Coast, and we have one department that's supposed to reflect everything that's going on. Do you think we should break up the DFO into 3 separate departments, North, West, and East? Or do you think we should actually devolve the whole function to the provinces? Mr. Zeman, we'll give you a shot at this one.
That's a loaded question. We always say be careful what you wish for, and we've seen that go in both directions. And I can speak provincially right now. The Ministry of Waterlands Resource Stewardship is suffering probably from even worse budget cuts than DFO is. So I don't have a good answer, but I will indicate that there is definitely a feeling out west that, well, first of all, our fisheries are different than out east. That's 100% true. I think that there is a major attachment across the country around fish, but there's definitely a perspective that the folks out west get managed the same way as the folks out east do, and our fisheries are very, very different on this side of the coast. So the question around DFO, yes, there is definitely in our membership discussion about whether the organization is structured for success. It clearly isn't. Would there be interest in moving it to a BC-based or a Pacific region focus? Yes, I think absolutely.
That's it. I'm good.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. It's very interesting. We are talking about taking back self-determination by the provinces. I like that principle. That said, once again, at the fisheries colloquium that we had in Caracat, we raised the fact that even if someday Quebec were to become a country, something that could happen very soon, we will still have sincere and deep relationships with the entire fisheries region of the St. Lawrence Gulf and the entire region. And this relationship would bind us forever. Now, the idea of reflecting, and now I'm talking to a scientist, anyone who could respond, the idea of having a body that oversees all that. Maybe look at the West, look at one way, look at the East together with the Maritimes and the North as well, and also within DFO. But still with environmental mediation at the top, because everything is tied when we're talking about nature. So is this an interesting proposal in your opinion? We don't have much time left. Maybe the 3 scientists, one after the other, could answer.
I'll jump in quickly. And I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but I'd think about what are the policies to ensure, that independence is really independence and it's not tied into any other types of influence. It is just a scientific body. The other thing I'd draw upon and kind of came up with discussion with careful what you wish for with the province versus federal, like who's in charge. I think it's the thing to think about is like, well, what happens when things go wrong and when decisions made which aren't fair? Like in BC, we have a ombudsperson who can kind of independently judge if things are fair. There's not such a federal ombudsperson to investigate those kind of things within DFO. So that might be something to think about.
Thank you, Madam Debian. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. First and foremost, thank you to my colleague, Mr. Small, for bringing to my attention the incredible accomplishment that you received. I don't know how I missed that. So Natural Resources, the BC Business 2024 Woman of the Year Award for Changemaker runner-up. That's just an incredible honor. And I want to reiterate, so well-deserved. I was so honored to be able to tour Skipperotto and to be able to see the incredible work happening there. I'm very impressed, to say the least. But I would love to be able to get an answer from you around the previous question, just as a reminder around the way in which you feel, through the chair, would be the best way to move forward with the protection and equitable distribution of those benefits to Canadians.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for the question and for your kind words. Mr. Chair, yes, I think that the most important thing that we need to do is embed into the Act the protections for harvesters and for local community members and for Canadian consumers. I think that that can come in some of the forms that I've mentioned so far, but certainly embedding into the Act that consultation is another important point. So the ways in which community members are consulted in the management of fisheries, through whether that's through the advisory boards and roundtables, I think is important. I think the minister's discretion around shared decision-making can be looked at in the Act, and that can help ensure that community members, not only licensed owners, are consulted. So I think that's really important. And just ensuring that that kind of owner-operator and, the protection of license the active harvesters is embedded into the Act. I think those are some of the critical things that we need to see here. I'll thank Mr. Hardy for bringing up the question about how should fisheries be managed. I think as we face climate change and we face further uncertainty, our fisheries need to be nimble. They need to be able to respond to the crises that are continuing to unfold. Locally managed fisheries globally tend to fare better with managing and being more nimble. And so we look to our neighbors to the south, where fisheries managed by the state, and we see them being just better positioned to be able to hear from local constituents, to hear from active harvesters, and to make changes to protect fisheries. So I think those are some of the important things that we need to see to protect community-based harvesters.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Bragdon for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do want to address my question to you, Ms. Strobel. Thank you for being here today and your incredible accomplishments. Skipperotto is truly a remarkable story and inspirational, to say the least. So, when speaking to, obviously, the Fisheries Act, but I want to kind of take it to a broader level and get your input and insight on this. From the various witnesses we've heard from throughout my time on committee, anytime we're talking to those closest to the ground and to those who are actually in the harvesting business, they are seeing areas of incredible opportunity and potential within their sectors that doesn't seem to be being recognized at the governmental level. And adaptation is not happening near fast enough to be able to pivot to take advantage of those opportunities. I was wondering if you could speak into that. So many times we hear about what's wrong in the sector, what needs to be addressed, the challenges that we face, and there's a plethora of that. But I would be interested to hear where you see opportunities if the fishery in Canada was repositioned better to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think that our fisheries, they don't feel nimble. We don't feel that the Fisheries Act allows for rapid enough change to address climate changes, to address changes in abundance. We don't feel on the West Coast that there are mechanisms for West Coast harvesters to feel heard. They don't feel that those mechanisms are there, and that the knowledge of fish harvesters and people based in communities, that there isn't a mechanism to share that knowledge or for that knowledge to be respected. So we hear harvesters all the time commenting that fish are returning to one river or another, but that there are no officers monitoring those rivers anymore. That knowledge isn't even getting back. So, we feel that the Fisheries Act was written at a time, initially before Canada, or before British Columbia was even part of Canada. And so really considerations aren't in place to recognize that knowledge of people on the ground, to feed that back to decision makers, and then to have quick decisions being made. And so we're going to continue to see those changes. As waters warm, we will have species coming up from California and have no fisheries for them because we're just not acting in a way that's nimble enough. So I think the Act needs high level to be reconsidered in light of respect for the knowledge in fishing communities from harvesters and from people who are on the ground.
To get it really closer to the ground, that those closest to the ground have more decision-making authority. And I know on the East Coast, Atlantic Canada, there's more stuff that's under provincial jurisdiction than there is on the West Coast, and they're often quite emphatic on making sure that we understand that jurisdictional distinction. There's nothing worse sometimes than someone that's further and further away from it making decisions that have massive consequence for those living in those communities and whose livelihoods are dependent upon it. So the input from the harvesters in your area and the people in your area, do they feel like under the current construct that they have a direct access, or their concerns are being heard? Do you want to comment a bit on that?
Mm-hmm. No, I will definitely say that the harvesters in our community don't feel that there is a mechanism for them to be heard, particularly because most of the young harvesters are leasing licenses, and therefore they don't have a seat at advisory board tables because they don't own that access. And so it's very difficult for them to be heard. Even right now with roundtables that are happening, they refer to people like me as one community, and then they refer to the industry as the people who own licenses. And so we as active harvesters find that challenging, that we're not even considered part of the industry because we don't own the access. So the entire language is set up for there not to be a mechanism for our voices to be heard. So we hear that frustration. We hear harvesters, when I call them up to say, listen, I'm going to Ottawa, I have this opportunity to speak on the Fisheries Act, and I hear the despondence, the why even bother? They don't listen to us. We don't have a say. And to me, that's a crisis of democracy, that if people, Canadian citizens, don't feel that it's even worth trying anymore, that's a real problem.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Morrissey now for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Listening with interest, it concerns me, Ms. Strobel, when you say fishers on the West Coast have given up. Could you give one recommendation to this committee on one change to the Act that would allow the process to begin of structuring the West Coast fishery more in the lines of owner-operator, because they are very different? Could you give an opinion on that?
Mm-hmm. I think it's correct that the fisheries are very different on the East Coast and the West Coast. What is consistent, though, is that without protections for active harvesters, the dollars flow away from those.
And quite frankly, it should be unacceptable to a G7 country like Canada that the resource is going. But if we don't begin, you will never get there. And that leads to the lack of confidence that you are articulating here from BC fishers. So it didn't occur on the East Coast overnight. So what preliminary steps would you recommend that you would like to see in the Fishery Act that would begin the journey towards owner-operator?
Mm-hmm. I would argue that the Fisheries Act does provide the authority for the minister to with a stroke of a pen, a ministerial order to say that West Coast fisheries are moving toward a made in BC owner-operator policy. But I think that a bit of vagueness in the Act makes that a bit gray area, and when there's gray area, people don't act. And so if the language in the Fisheries Act would change to say that the minister must consider socioeconomics in her decisions, then I think that would give the confidence for her to act immediately. And as soon as that's done, as soon as that direction is indicated, as you say, it's going to take time. But the time should start from the moment at which we say, British Columbia will move towards, Pacific region will move towards an owner-operator and fleet separation policies. Now let's begin that 7-year clock, as we did on the East Coast, to say, let's figure out how, based on each fishery. But without that initial statement, I think that's what's holding us up. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your candidness and clear direction on one recommendation. I want to go to Mr. Zeman. You referenced, I believe it was you, the department is not structured for success. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, there's a few pieces to that, and I appreciate the discussion with Dr. Mordecai as well, because we experienced this with Steelhead. So, I mean, we would call it a separation between state and church. So you instead of having people who identify what's available and people who identify regulations running into the same stream, the science piece, the fishery stock assessment piece should be, and the species at risk piece should be a separate channel from the manager's piece. So you have people on one side who lift up the science and the harvest that's available, and then that would go over to people who can identify how the harvest is carried out. Currently, those two things run into each other and we end up with externalities. We end up in the case of Steelhead where we had ATIPs that showed that the deputy's office was interfering in what's supposed to be an independent process. And so how do you create that independence? Well, you give them lines of authority that are separate. I think that's kind of the best choice or the best approach. The other thing that really concerns us is that we're moving into a world
Excuse me, Mr. Zeman, but those lines of authority ultimately must go to the top, which is the minister, correct?
Yes. And so you may have structures that go to two separate places, right? And as long as the minister isn't reaching in, what we're trying to identify is Canadians need to be able to see a place where the science is carried out without being fettered by someone from above. That's the concern, and it's well documented as well.
In the department, we've seen it over the years. When the science recommendation went to the minister, ran afoul of the political expediency of the day and was being pushed, and generally, and it's not because the opposition cries foul, the opposition of the day, when a department rolls back quotas based on science to overturn that the fishers are always right. How would you advise or recommend that not occur?
Well, that's a great question. You could go to an independent model, and I believe that's what the other witness referred to when she talked about how people are engaged and more nimble in the States. That's because they have commissions down there. So that's one solution. But as it relates to the high end, you can always have policy and decision makers who make decisions. The big thing for Canadians is to see the transparency around the scientific advice that happens. I think that's part of it.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. You're gone a couple of seconds over. That concludes our round of questioning in the second panel. I want to say a huge thank you to Ms. Strobel, Mr. Zeman and Mr. Mordecai for being here today, both in person and on screen, as they provided their knowledge to the committee as we go through this report. Hearing nothing else, meeting adjourned.